Hello, welcome everybody. We're so glad that you could join us for our webinar today. We'll be speaking about NIST 800-171 compliance. And as many of you are already aware, the deadline for contractors who are serving Department of Defense agencies was last December. But since then, there have been some updates to what compliance means, and I think you'll be interested in hearing exactly what those developments are. Plus, we'll also talk about compliance for any contractors who are serving non-Department of Defense agencies. NIST 800-171 applies to those agencies as well, and the deadline that those entities are tracking to is November of 2018. So we'll talk a little bit more about that. So before we get started, I want to cover off on just a few quick housekeeping notes. All attendees are on mute throughout the presentation. However, we do encourage you to submit any questions that you may have. You'll see a questions dialog box to the right of your screen. So certainly feel free to interact with us in that way, and Dave will be answering questions as we go along. All right, so with that, I'd like to welcome and introduce you to our speaker. Dave Gray is a cybersecurity leader who is CISSP, CAP, and PMP certified, among many other credentials. He's focused on governance, risk management, and compliance, particularly within the framework of the National Institute of Standards and Technology, better known as NIST. He served in the Texas Army National Guard as a lieutenant colonel, and he currently shares his knowledge and expertise by teaching security certification classes as well as regulatory compliance courses. So welcome, Dave. I'll turn it over to you.
Thank you, Carrie. I appreciate it. We'll go ahead and jump to the next slide here. And Carrie's pretty much already covered this, other than the fact that you've got this lovely picture of that handsome devil staring back at you. I've got a lot of experience with information security. I try not to call myself an expert, but I certainly do have a lot of experience, and I do appreciate opportunities to be able to share that experience at every chance that I get. So what we're discussing today is now that the DoD deadline is passed, and now we're in the current timetable of how the federal agencies are going to push out their version of compliance. What does all this mean? And bottom line, we've been talking about this controlled unclassified information in ad infinitum, so to speak, for about the past year in various dialogues. And so today, it's kind of where the rubber meets the road. So, key points here. Controlled unclassified information will be safeguarded. Supply chains and supply chain accountability is now being built directly into the Department of Defense contracts and the federal contracts. So from this point forward, those persons that are either currently in possession, either as a prime vendor or as a subcontractor, a DFARS or a FAR contract, for their lives, security assessments, risk assessments, and plan of actions and milestones are going to become a way of life. For those folks that are looking forward to working with federal contracts or DoD contracts, same thing. Security assessments, risk assessments, and plan of actions and milestones will become a way of life. We're going to talk about these here in just a bit more detail. I'm going to be going fairly fast. I've got about 30 slides, which is not too bad for a 1-hour block. I do want to make sure, though, that we have sufficient time to do some Q&A at the end. But by all means, as Carrie mentioned, if you've got a question, please go ahead, type it into the questions from audience block on your screen, and then she'll try to get my attention here whenever I'm taking a breath in between slides. So, the new DFARS and FAR reality. The U.S. government, Department of Defense, and federal agencies all require their contracts to include clauses mandating compliance with CUI information security controls. What does that really mean? It means now if you do not comply with these controls, then you can be found in breach of contract. If you develop a history as an organization of being in breach of contract, of course, that would not be favorable to either the continuation of your current contracts or the ability to be selected for additional contracts. With the federal folks and DoD, they're now running or moving into a phase where they're doing quite a bit of staff training, because just like the prime vendors and the subcontractors, there's a lot of internal staff, either wearing a uniform or just going to a federal job, that truly have not yet become fully aware of this CUI reality. Now, most of what this reality is that we will be assessing and learning about security controls and how effective they are. Advantages that we have, which we're going to talk about some more, are listed there on the screen. One is they've now published, as of November last year, a draft version of the alpha version of the 800-171. So this is NIST 800-171A, assessing security requirements. Keyword, assessing. So if you're familiar with the NIST works and you've seen 800-53A, you know that it's a companion document that gives you a load of information about assessing each and every one of those controls. Now, in addition to the 171A, there is now also printed as of November 2017, a NIST handbook. So it's NIST Handbook 162. And you can find those based on the URLs that we'll show in some of the slides here coming up. But you can also find those simply by Googling that, and it will take you straight to the location where NIST stores those. Now, just be careful when you do that, though, to ensure that you're obtaining the most current copy. If you Google right now for simply 800-171, you may, in fact, find a copy that's about a year and a half old. So you want to make sure that we always use the most current copy. So what's the goal here? What is the CUI goal as it relates to the supply chain? So this matrix that you're seeing in front of you is a risk matrix. And as you see across the top, we talk about what is the level of impact, and specifically, what is the level of adverse impact based on a security control not working. Now look on the left side, and these are the likelihoods of security controls not working. So if you've got a security control that has a high likelihood, a very likely of not working, then it also, if it also has, I'm sorry, I was reading a note here from the question from the audience. Yes, I will try to speak louder. If you have a high likelihood of a security control not working, and you have a high level of adverse impact, then that would be considered a serious risk. And generically, we'll call it a red double risk, and that would be the opposite extreme from risk that you're willing to accept. So we talked about some updated requirements. What exactly do I mean by updated requirements? So if you look at the publications from DoD, they have not really put things in writing. That being said, and we have the URL so you can hear it yourself if you like, there was testimony by the Defense Undersecretary of Acquisition for Technology and Logistics. Testimony to the Senate Armed Services Committee, where she stated that the only requirement is to ensure you know what your plan is and that you know how you're looking forward to deal with it. Now, what that says is that you have a POA. In order to have a POA&M, a plan of actions and milestones, you must have done a gap analysis. So the steps are do a gap analysis, see where you're at on the controls, and then for every control that's not fully implemented, have a plan. Well, have a plan on what? I mean, really, where is the CUI? So depending on your organization, your information environment may be contained in a walled off area within your network, like we show here On the screen, the yellow area with CUI labeled shows that we have created firewalls and we've provided a exclusive zone just for CUI. That is, in most cases, the least expensive way to deal with the additional controls that are mandated through DFARS and FAR. Because if it's not exclusively set to a specific domain, then it becomes commingled with everything else you have. And being commingled would then indicate or imply that all the controls under the 171 now apply to your entire environment. So technically, specifically, what is CUI? It's information that law, regulation, or government-wide policy requires to have safeguarding or disseminating controls. So, safeguarding. How are we going to protect it? Disseminating. How does the information, the CUI, flow into and out of our networks? Who do we distribute that to? And who says we have to do this anyway? Well, there's a number of federal reasons to distribute it or to control it. We have a couple of executive orders written up by some successive presidents of the United States. We have the current version of FISMA. Now, most of you are familiar with FISMA, Federal Information Management Act, Security Management Act. That's from back in 2002. This is different, all right? This is the Federal Information Security Modernization Act of 2014, which is addressing the problems that have been noticed with supply chains causing prime vendors or causing federal Department of Defense agencies to become susceptible to being compromised. So what types of things are we discussing when we say CUI? So the way that the government segregates stuff, first off, the documents that we see coming from NIST, the National Institute of Standards and Technology, are being written in collaboration with another federal agency, NARA, the National Archives and Records Administration. So NARA is the executive agent. They have been chartered to take the lead on how we will protect controlled and classified information. And what you see on the screen here is the primary list of top-level CUI categories. Now, each one of these may, in fact, have multiple subcategories. And each one of these may, in fact, have very specific or unique requirements in addition to the 171. As an example, I think there's some nuclear regulatory items that if you go into the nuclear category for CUI, you'll see that there are specific additional requirements that need to be complied with. Now, as you go through this list, you just think to yourself, which of these areas would I be involved in? And I'll tell you that if you pick one, whether you know it or not, you've actually picked two. And the reason for that is over on the left-hand side, about the fourth or so bullet up from the bottom, it says Information Systems Vulnerability Information with a marking acronym of IS, V as in Victor, I. That is all the documentation. That is your security assessments, those are your security plans, those are your POA&Ms. All of those documents, as they pertain to CUI, become a category all unto itself. And so if, as an example, if you deal with critical infrastructure, you'll have critical infrastructure plus ICI. If you deal with control technical information, you'll have control technical information plus ISVI. So keep in mind that everything that you do in the way of documenting, and a lot of this is about documentation, will automatically fall under the CUI rules, and as a result, fall under the marking rules as well. So why is CUI important? And who is actually impacted? What are the consequences in case we don't have compliance? Now, as a security professional, I will be the first to say that compliance does not mean security, all right? But compliance does provide an indicator of how secure information is. So what's the timeline for the FAR to DFARS? Because technically we know that, hey, the DFARS timeline, it ended. It was effective last day of last year, December 31st, 2017. But as we discussed briefly, the definition of compliance has been tweaked. So CUI addresses sensitive data held by thousands of vendors and suppliers on behalf of federal and military agencies. When we safeguard that information, we're safeguarding it for the purpose of confidentiality, integrity, and availability, or CIA. And for those folks that are familiar with the security world, CIA is like the triad. If you ensure the confidentiality, integrity, and availability of information as it was designed to have, then you've pretty much met your goal. Now, as an example of where this basically blew up, so to speak, and it's not a military example, I could give those, but some of them are actually classified. Just think back to when the Target retail chain had that huge breach with credit card data. The credit card data could be considered unclassified information. However, it's obviously sensitive and we want to control it. How did that occur? It occurred because the supply chain working for Target was compromised. Specifically, there was an air conditioning company that was compromised. And this particular air conditioning company, like many large air conditioning companies with many of their clients, like Target and other large retail chains, they had access directly into the main network for the client, this client in this case being Target. So when that smaller company was compromised, the malicious actors, the bad guys, discovered how to get in to the bigger company, Target. And so they used passwords and user IDs that were discovered in files at the air conditioning company. They discovered how to make the correct connections to the, in this case, it was a vendor portal for Target. And that gave them access to the entire Target network. All right, so simple things like that, if we're not careful, our supply chain can then become a threat to the primary organization. So who, again, is impacted by CUI? Well, it's not just the companies I've been referring to. There's companies that list there at the bottom, the prime vendors, subcontractors, suppliers, etc. It also affects the staffing at the DoD components themselves and at the federal agencies themselves. And specifically for the federal agencies, they're now going through a training period where they're designing the training that they need and distributing it out to the folks that require it. That very last bullet I want to point out, though, this is the entire supply chain. The entire supply chain shows that it includes both U.S.-based and offshore. All right. I'm going to take a moment here and discuss a question that just came up. I do have one person that's, it's not technically a question. They're saying they're having difficulties hearing me. I am attempting to speak distinctly and loudly and not soft. So hopefully this is an issue for that one individual. We do have a number of viewers with us today. But I have done pretty much what I can do is trying to ensure that I'm not speaking too softly. Timeline. When are we supposed to get all this stuff done? Well, the timeline that was advertised by DoD, and actually not advertised very well, was December 31st of 2017. And then on December 7th, they had that testimony provided by the Undersecretary of Logistics to the Senate Armed Services Committee, where they kind of backpedaled. and they redefine what compliance actually means. And that redefining of compliance then gives us some breathing room, but it also gives us a precursor to what is happening in the federal side, not just the D&D side. I do have an indicator on the Q&A that there's another person that has an issue, so again, I will raise my voice and hopefully everybody will be able to hear me. So, timeline for DFARS, technically it was the end of last year, but now they redefined compliance. Timeline for federal contracts is phased in over a period of 2 full years, but right now they're about a year behind. And so they are working on how to do their training. They're working on the development and deploying of that training, which per the original timeline would have been about a year ago. Now, after this webinar is over, Terry LeBlanc will be sending out copies of the PDF files, so don't worry about trying to scramble and read the small print on the URL listed at the bottom of the slide, but that URL does provide specific additional guidance from the federal government effective as of last week. So we're seeing quite a few things here that are changing on a rapid and evolving basis. But notice that rapid for the United States government is not necessarily the normal person's definition of rapid. So what is this new definition? What is compliance? Compliance with information security controls is achieved by implementing the control and its derived requirements, okay, and now here's a key word, or documenting how they're going to go deal with those, right? And in the federal world, their documentation when they have a problem that they're dealing with is called a plan of action and milestones. And so you have 110 controls. Some of them may be fully compliant. If they're not, then they should be documented in a POA&M. Consequences, though, for noncompliance. Consequences can include, but not be limited to, loss of your current contract. At this point, I don't foresee that happening, but as this new reality becomes more thoroughly integrated with contracting at large, I can definitely see where it would immediately begin to influence future contract selection for those people who are trying to get contracts right now. If they have a history of not being compliant, not implementing information security controls the way that the requirements state, or if they have actually no understanding what those controls are supposed to be, in a competitive process, if another vendor has a similar proposal, yet also as part of that proposal can demonstrate that they are maintaining security controls, then they will have a competitive edge. Does that mean they automatically get the contract? Obviously not. There's a lot of different things going on here. But that will give them a competitive edge. So for the controls, it's essential and critical that you understand your organization's posture on those controls right now. What is your gap between what you're doing today and what's required? Document that gap and then come up with a plan. It does not have to be a detailed plan. It can be very high level, just a few sentences, with some milestones as projected dates. As long as that plan is something that you and your point of contact at the government have agreed to. Now, if you're a subcontractor looking for a prime vendor, then your point of contact is the contracting officer for the prime vendor. If you are the prime vendor, then your point of contact is the contracting officer at either the federal agency or the DoD component that you're working with. One thing I want to try to do a spoiler alert on here, do not expect them to have the same definition of compliance as what you have. There has not been consistent guidance provided to contracting officers, right? So that means that each contracting officer, who likely is not a security professional, will be reaching back into their own organizations and trying to find out, well, what am I supposed to do with these contracts? And so for the near future, and when I say near future, I'm thinking in terms of years, 2018, 2019, most likely maybe even into 2020, there will still be a lot of ambiguity, and there won't be the type of specificity in understanding how you're applying security controls that most of us would prefer. So you're left with two options. Option A is you've done everything. All of your control objectives have been implemented, and every control is documented in some type of control implementation summary, and your contracting officer has a copy of that, and everybody is happy in the world. Or, most likely, for about probably 99% of the vendors and subcontractors, you're going to go with option B. Option B says, yep, you know where you're at, you know how to convey to your contracting officer what your status is. You've provided a control implementation summary that lists the 110 controls individually with some type of indication that, yeah, you're either compliant or you're on the way to being compliant, or that you haven't even started. And then for everything where you haven't started, or you're just on your way, you'll have an entry in your POA&M. Now, the way I do this personally is I work with a large spreadsheet that I've created for the consulting part of what we do at CyberDefenses. And so we can align the control status with a POA&M topic or subject, if appropriate. So compliance equal implementation, or an implementation summary and a POA&M. Well, how do we get there? What's the process? First off, let's establish the scope. Now, if you go back to at the beginning where I showed that graphic with a local area network inside of a cloud, and then a firewall that touches all these different things that are outside the network, if your scope is your entire internal network, which could include remote sites, then you're going to have a large challenge, right? We'll talk about that here more in a bit. But essentially, you need to start collecting data on where you're at, and then assess your security controls. And go back to that slide, the very beginning, the pretty colored one with the red and the yellow and the green. If you've got controls that are highly likely to fail, and you've got, as a result of those failures, an adverse impact that could be very high, then those would be the areas that you want to prioritize. So analyze all those results, document your compliance gaps, and then create your summary and your POA&M. So the process typically identifies gaps and areas that require remediation. We talked a bit about scope, so I'm not going to dwell on that too much here. Bottom line, scope is the most important aspect. If you commingle your CUI data with the rest of the data in your organization, you just created extra work. Best option, isolate those portions of the network that have CUI, and then control and enforce access controls and data that flows in and across those boundaries. When you do your assessment, if you're familiar with the 171 already, you'll likely conduct your assessment based on these 14 families. 14 families go from access control to awareness and training to audit and accountability, all the way down to system and information integrity. Now, are these in some type of priority order? No. No. Specifically, each one of these 110 controls is equally as important as other controls. But I will tell you, some of these controls are going to be much more difficult to implement. Specifically, the control that requires multi-factor access for people with access to CUI. If anyone had to pick the one single item that will be the largest challenge, it's likely to be multi-factor access. Well, if it's such a big challenge, why did the government decide that it was a requirement? Because multi-factor access is the one best way to ensure that malicious actors, otherwise known as bad guys, cannot access your CUI. If you've got your CUI cordoned off so that only authorized individuals have access, and those authorized individuals have multi-factor access, meaning that they have something physical in their possession, either they've received an SMS text with a code number, an email with a code number, or they have an actual hardware device that lists a code number, and that code number is required to access the CUI, then all the bad guys in the rest of the world cannot get to your data. Because guess what? They don't have those code numbers. Are there various ways of doing multi-factor access? Absolutely. Are there better ways and not so great ways? Absolutely. As of the moment, this may not hold true forever, but as of the moment, there is no specific guidance on the type of multi-factor access that you must implement. So today, it's flexible. But if it stays that way next year, only next year we'll be able to tell. So how do you go about doing these self-assessments? Where does the guidance come from? Well, the first set of guidance comes from the 800-171 itself. Remember what I mentioned about Googling for it and making sure that you have the right revision? The current revision is revision 1, and that includes updates as of November 28, 2017. If you have something older than that, and this is listed like on the front page or the second page, then you've got an older version. And if you simply Google for 171, guess what? You're going to get an older version. Will that same response lead you to the correct one? Yes. But you have to read what you download to ensure that it is, in fact, the correct one. And then, effective November of last year, we have some additional guidance, the alpha version of the 171 that I talked about, and this handbook that is now available. Both of these provide additional opportunity for that specificity that your information security professionals love to see, because that lets them figure out how exactly they need to implement security controls. Now, as you look at this page, this is a screenshot of the first control in the 171 alpha. Yes, it's an eye chart, all right? I get that. Don't worry about being able to read it at the moment, because we're going to push out a PDF copy of all these slides after the webinar today. It may actually be tomorrow morning before you see it. But what this approach does is define exactly for this particular control what would be an appropriate assessment process. Additionally, we have the handbook that also was published November of last year, and it provides a similar set of processes or procedures. This one's a little bit more for the layman's perspective or context. This one provides each of the 110 controls the opportunity for you to determine what is your status. Either yes, you're compliant, no, you're not compliant. Maybe you have partial compliance. You could have a case where it does not apply, although we might need to discuss whether that's actually true. Or you could have an alternative approach. If you have an alternative approach, I suggest that you ensure that your contracting officer agrees with you that it is appropriate. In this process, it comes out with just a bunch of everyday type questions, like, does the company use passwords? Yes, no, partially, etc. Does the company have an authentication mechanism? Yes, no, partially, whatever. So this gives you a lot more granularity to how you're actually going to sit down and evaluate and conduct a gap analysis of your organization. That is, if you don't call me to come do the gap analysis for you, in which case we'll sit down together. Documentation of all of this is critical because, as a lot of people know, if it's not documented, it didn't happen. So if you've been audited, whether you're in the military or in the federal world or even in the private sector, if you've been audited and you claim a certain answer to a certain question, and it's not readily apparent that there are adequate logs or copies or whatever is necessary to prove it, then it doesn't really matter what you claim. The audit result is going to be could not support the answer provided during the audit. In other words, they did not have documentation. So that's part of the new reality too. Do we want to do documentation? I know I don't. I hate it. It's like one of the most boring things in the world. However, in order to demonstrate and prove that I actually did what I said I was doing, then I've got to have some type of documentation. And when it comes to security, documentation is typically in what's referred to as a system security plan, or an SSP. The system security plan will have areas that include things like, well, did you actually have a plan to conduct your assessment? When you did your assessment, do you have a security assessment report that indicates, are the controls in place working effectively and as designed? And then only after you've done your security assessment report can you then do a risk assessment. Because to create the risk assessment, you have to know how well your security plan or your security controls are working. And of course, if you don't have security controls in effect, then that means that what you do have is a high likelihood that something's going to fail. What about noncompliance? At the moment, if you put that into a plan of action and milestones, a POA&M, then everything is fine, right? Just come up with a plan on what you're going to do as you continue to move forward. Now, typically, once you've established a POA&M, you will need to report progress on those POA&M items to your contracting officer. They may request that you report it as frequently as monthly, or they may say, no, just tell me if something goes south. Or they may say, I want to see a report every quarter. But this is totally up to the contracting officer, whether that contracting officer is at the prime vendor or at the DoD component or the federal agency. What does the POA&M itself document? Well, first off, it assigns an ID, an identification to every item that's being worked. So for tracking purposes, you can now say, I have this activity, I've given it this particular name, I can describe the activity as thus and so, I have a plan, I've identified resources and staff, and I've developed milestones that tell me that I am on track to resolve the issue. Many people that I work with, if you give them an assignment 6 months in advance and you call them up the day before it's due, they'll say, oh, I'm sorry, I forgot about that. It slipped my mind. It fell through the cracks. So it is absolutely critical that you develop reasonable milestones so that you can get people to check back in with you and let you know that you are, in fact, working on what you're supposed to be working on. I just got a question. I'm going to go ahead and address it now. The question is there a way to accept the risk like you do with the risk management framework and an authorizing official? What if a control, such as multi-factor authentication, is not possible? So we're going to break that down real quick. First off, the risk management framework does allow organizations to prioritize risk that they've discovered and then been able to articulate to the business level. And the business level does have in this case, the authorization or the ability to authorize an acceptance of risk. In other words, the business says it's going to cost too much to address that, so we're going to simply accept it at face value. Now, does that mean that you can do that in the CUI world? There is not available guidance that says that we can do that today. Do I expect that it will evolve in that direction? Well, let's just say that I don't expect that it won't evolve in that direction. But I will say that you must prioritize your resources. Resources can be money, it can be funding, it can be staff, it can be headcount, it can be hours in the day. You must prioritize your resources so that you can get the biggest bang for your buck. Work on the stuff that creates the most risk. But at this moment, don't anticipate that you can simply have the business or the authorization official simply say, oh, that's good, we'll deal with that, we'll live with it. So, as a recap, CUI's information, that law, regulation, and government-wide policy requires to have safeguarding or disseminating controls. And if you handle CUI, you must achieve compliance, or you can lose your contracts or be excluded from new contracts. Keep in mind, there are multiple types of assessments. If you tell somebody you're going to do a risk assessment, you need to understand that in order to accomplish a risk assessment, you must have previously completed a security control assessment. Keep in mind also that these 110 controls, they're just the starting point. When you cross-reference to the other documents that are provided in the mapping appendix at the end of the 171, specifically the mapping to the 800-53, which is a document 3 times as large as the 171, you'll understand that it's more than just these 110 top-level and mostly somewhat vague controls. Absolutely keep in mind is that if it's not documented, it didn't happen, right? And how do you document it? With a control implementation summary and a plan of action and milestones. So what is this all going to cost me? How much effort do I need to put in? So the lawyer's answer is, it depends, right? It depends on what your current security, maturity, and resources are for your organization. How much in-house expertise have you got versus how much you need to go contract out? If there is a silver lining in this, it's that there are plenty of companies, the one that I work with, CyberDefenses, being one of them, that can provide subject matter experts in order to provide you assistance. And speaking of CyberDefenses, they have a couple of areas that they focus on. One is their academy. So they have a large range of instruction available, primarily online classes, but because I happen to live close by, they do offer on-premise classes. And if you've got sufficient students, then even though we may not have a class coming up at that time frame is good for you, then by all means go ahead and call us anyway, because it's quite possible that we could configure a custom, at least as far as timing is concerned, a custom class to meet your requirements. In general, CyberDefenses provides managed security services for all things related to security. However, specifically to the 800-171, they offer a couple of items. One is a do-it-yourself program. This do-it-yourself program is $14.95. That includes the 2-day online class and also includes a written system security plan. That system security plan is a template that can be revised and modified specifically for your organization. And just the template itself is about 450, 500 pages, something like that. So if you were to try to sit back and see, okay, well, how long would it take my in-house people to create a 500-page document, you can probably make the conclusion that it may be simpler to go purchase one. The other things that we can provide is expert leadership in doing those gap analysis and those security assessments and those risk assessments. Those assessments that we provide assistance with will minimize the burden on your staff, and it will provide the fastest way to work through this whole DFARS and FAR new reality. Well, having said all that, again, I'm Dave Gray. There's contact information if you want to reach out to me directly. Those are the things that I specialize in personally, but there's obviously additional things available depending on who you work with. And I'll look for any type of questions from the audience here for a moment. And if I don't have any more come up from the ones that I've seen so far, then I'll probably turn it back over to Carrie LeBlanc so that she can kind of close us out. All right, so I don't see any more questions coming up. And I do see that we still have a full house here online, so let me make sure that I give them the opportunity to hear from Carrie, who's going to close us out and give you more information on when you can get a copy or how you'll get a copy of the slide deck and some of the other things that we have available related to NIST 171, 800-171. So Carrie, if you would, go ahead.
Yes, absolutely. Thank you. Excuse me. Thank you, Dave. Thanks for sharing your expertise and your insights. This is really incredibly valuable information, so we certainly appreciate it. And I want to thank all of our attendees for your time today. I know we are all incredibly busy, so I appreciate you carving out the time to join us for this discussion. And as Dave mentioned, we will be sending all of you an email that will include a copy of the PDF presentation. It will also include some additional details on some of the things that, some of the resources that are available to help organizations as they are looking to comply with the NIST 800-171 standards. If you have any further questions for us or would like to reach out to us and just continue the conversation, we are more than happy to do that. You can reach us either by email. You can send an email to info@cyberdefenses.com or visit our website at www.cyberdefenses.com. And then, of course, when you receive the email, you'll have a direct line of contact to just reply back to us. So with that, I'd like to say once again, thank you so very much, and we hope that you have a wonderful rest of your day. Thanks.